17-year-old Jay Gardiner enters the Pacific Ocean off Monastery Beach with one impossible goal: find the remains of his dead father. Mitt Gardiner died by suicide a year earlier, sinking himself beneath the same waters using diving weights. His body was never recovered. Jay tells himself the bones will give his family closure and repair his reputation. Beneath that is a deeper need: to offer the dead a final act of love without argument. Whalefall begins as an attempt to solve grief with a physical object. That impulse is painfully human. When a relationship ends without reconciliation, people often search for one final task that can make the emotional mess feel measurable. Jay cannot apologize to Mitt, argue with him, or ask what he actually wanted. Bones seem simpler. They can be found, carried home, buried, and completed. The ocean will soon teach Jay that grief does not work like recovery work. Chapter 2. Mitt Gardiner, the father who filled every room. Mitt was larger than life to almost everyone except the people who lived with him. He was a diver, boat captain, storyteller, environmental obsessive, and local legend who could turn ocean knowledge into mythology. To Jay, he was also demanding, unpredictable, humiliating, and often emotionally cruel. Mitt loved the sea with a clarity he rarely offered his family. He could identify whales, currents, marine behavior, and hidden dangers while failing to understand the damage his own intensity caused at home. Mitt gave Jay knowledge that could save his life while making him feel too weak to deserve it. Kraus refuses an easy verdict. Mitt teaches wonder and fear with the same voice. Chapter 3. 3000. Peace Jay enters the water with a full scuba tank reading 3,000 pounds per square inch. That number becomes the novel's clock. Every breath spends a piece of his remaining life. Even before disaster strikes, Jay's breathing is too fast because anxiety is consuming oxygen. In his head, he can already hear Mitt correcting him. "Slow down, control yourself. Don't waste air." Jay hates that voice, but he also obeys it. Parental voices do not disappear with death. They become internal systems. Jay dives alone, but psychologically Mitt enters the water with him. The shrinking PSI numbers make that inner conflict physical. Every breath requires Jay to regulate panic, and every moment of regulation uses skills associated with the man he resents. The countdown therefore measures more than oxygen. It measures how long Jay can keep treating his father's lessons as contamination before admitting some of them are now keeping him alive. Chapter 4. The Boy Who Ran Away. Jay. Left home before Mitt's final illness consumed the family, years of tension had culminated in a frightening incident in which a drunken Mitt pushed Jay toward hurting himself as a warped demonstration of toughness. Jay finally chose escape. He moved between friends' homes and tried to imagine a future in forestry, away from diving, away from Monterey, and especially away from his father. Then Mitt developed advanced mesothelioma. Jay's mother and sisters called, texted, pleaded, and told him that Mitt wanted to see him. Jay stayed away. After Mitt died, absence hardened into guilt. Jay knows leaving may have saved him, yet part of him still believes self-protection made him responsible for what followed. Survival feels like betrayal. That guilt matters because Jay is still young enough to believe he had adult power over an adult crisis. He judges his decision to leave with knowledge he only gained afterward. Kraus never suggests Jay's absence was meaningless, but he carefully separates regret from responsibility. A teenager can wish he had returned without accepting ownership of a parent's illness, despair, or final decision. Chapter 5. Monastery Beach. The dive itself is dangerous before anything extraordinary happens. Monastery Beach is infamous for rough conditions, sudden depth, and powerful water. Jay knows the risks because Mitt taught them to him. He also knows that experienced divers would tell him not to go alone. Shame pushes Jay toward solitude. Asking for help would mean facing people who admired Mitt and admitting he does not know what else to do with regret. Underwater, isolation stops being psychological and becomes a survival problem. Chapter 6. The giant squid. Deep beneath the surface, Jay encounters something almost mythological: a giant squid. The creature is injured, enormous, and struggling. For a moment, awe overrides fear. Then the food chain arrives. A massive sperm whale attacks the squid, and Jay becomes entangled in the chaos. The squid wraps around him. The whale lunges. Jay is dragged with the prey toward an opening so large it stops looking like a mouth and starts looking like a cave. The ocean stops being landscape and becomes machinery. Jay is no longer observing nature. He has entered it. Chapter 7. Swallowed alive, Jay is pulled into the sperm whale's mouth and forced down its throat. His equipment strikes flesh and bone. Darkness becomes total. The last clear image of the outside world disappears, and the impossible becomes physical fact. Jay Gardiner has been swallowed alive. The whale is roughly 80 feet long and 60 tons, and its internal anatomy is large enough to trap him without immediately killing him. Kraus turns biology into horror. Jay is inside a living mammal whose muscles contract and gases poison. He has fallen into a whale and, symbolically, into his father's inheritance. Chapter 8. The first stomach. Jay lands in the whale's first stomach chamber alongside the dying giant squid. The squid attacks blindly, mistaking Jay's wetsuit and body for part of the surrounding threat. During the struggle, Jay suffers a severe wound near his neck. His regulator is nearly lost. The stomach contracts around him with crushing force. He is surrounded by seawater, blood, digestive matter, and darkness. His oxygen begins dropping rapidly. There is no neutral environment. Every surface moves. Every liquid may be dangerous. And even stillness is impossible because the room itself is an organ. Chapter 9. The voice of Mitt inside. The darkness. Jay begins hearing Mitt. Whether the voice is a hallucination caused by stress and toxic gases, a psychological projection, the whale itself filtered through memory, or something stranger is never cleanly resolved. What matters is that the voice sounds exactly like the father Jay remembers. Critical, impatient, knowledgeable, and impossible to ignore. Mitt tells him to move, remember, calculate, survive. Jay resents every instruction because obedience feels like returning to childhood. Yet every lesson Mitt forced into him may now be useful. The whale becomes a brutal therapy chamber where Jay cannot walk away from his father. He must finally argue with the dead. The ambiguity of the voice is important because a literal ghost would make reconciliation too easy. If Mitt were unquestionably supernatural, Jay could receive answers from outside himself. Instead, he must build those answers from memory. Fear, anger, and the fragments of love he spent years trying not to examine. Chapter 10. The second stomach, believing escape might exist deeper inside the digestive tract. Jay pushes into the second stomach chamber. It is worse. The environment is highly acidic and filled with hard, indigestible remains from previous meals, especially razor-sharp squid beaks. Acid burns his skin and gear. One beak impales his hand. The pain is nearly incapacitating, but Jay eventually realizes something important. The beak can become a tool. He pulls it free and keeps it. Later, he will name it Beaky. Jay's survival changes when he stops seeing every injury only as damage. The thing that wounds him can also become a tool. Chapter 11. Bad air. Jay starts becoming confused, sluggish, and strangely calm. The atmosphere inside the whale contains dangerous methane. At first, he does not understand why his thoughts are failing. Then an old memory returns. Years earlier, Mitt nearly died while diving into a contaminated industrial lagoon where bad air collected above the water. Jay remembers Mitt emerging disoriented from methane exposure. The memory tells him what is happening now. He forces the regulator back into his mouth and breathes clean air. Jay survives because he remembers Mitt surviving a similar danger. The useful and harmful parts of his inheritance cannot be neatly separated. Chapter 12. Beaky back. In the first stomach chamber, Jay uses the squid beak to cut a patch from his neoprene hood and press it against the wound in his neck. The improvised bandage slows the bleeding. He kisses the beak and names it Beaky, giving personality to the object that has become his closest companion. The deeper change is selectivity. Jay realizes he can use Mitt's knowledge without surrendering his identity or accepting all the damage that came with it. Chapter 13. The plan to make the whale vomit. Jay remembers that whales can regurgitate when distressed. He decides to stab the stomach wall with Beaky in hopes of triggering vomiting and being expelled through the mouth. Mitt's voice warns him not to do it. Jay ignores the warning, partly because he believes the plan can work, and partly because defying Mitt still feels emotionally necessary. He drives the beak into the whale. The result is catastrophic. Instead of vomiting, the terrified sperm whale begins a deep dive. Pressure rises around Jay as the animal descends. His regulator, lungs, joints, and injured body are pushed toward failure. Jay has resisted Mitt so completely that opposition itself has become another form of control. Chapter 14. The Deep Divers. The whale plunges deeper. Jay is crushed against the stomach wall. His air supply keeps falling. The pressure outside the whale increases while pressure inside Jay's body becomes its own threat. Kraus intercuts the descent with memories of Jay falling through childhood, from docks, bicycles, school achievement, friendships, and finally, his family. Physical descent mirrors Jay's emotional history. He begins to understand that falling is not the same as ending. Survival depends on what he does after the fall. Chapter 15. The orcas at extreme depth. Something violently strikes the sperm whale. Then it happens again. Jay realizes a pod of orcas is attacking the weakened animal. Sperm whales are enormous, but they are not invulnerable. The whale begins bleeding internally. Jay feels the impacts through the stomach walls and understands that if the whale dies too deep, his own chances disappear with it. His relationship to the creature changes. Until now, the whale has been his prison. Now it becomes another endangered body. Jay starts rooting for it. Jay's survival expands when he recognizes suffering outside himself, even in the animal that swallowed him. This is a subtle moral turning point. Until now, the whale has been something to escape or manipulate. Once Jay feels its fear and injury, survival becomes relational. He is no longer the only frightened body in the dark. Empathy gives him a reason to keep thinking beyond immediate pain. Chapter 16. The pod comes back. The injured male sperm whale cannot escape the orcas alone. Adult males are often solitary, and Jay fears isolation will kill them both. But nearby sperm whales respond. A pod arrives and helps drive the orcas away, forming a defensive social structure around the wounded animal. The rescue mirrors Jay's family. His mother and sisters kept reaching toward him even after he withdrew. The novel challenges the idea that strength means enduring everything alone. Mitt's version of masculinity often confused endurance with worth, cold water, pain, fear, humiliation. Take it and prove yourself. The sperm whales offer another model. Strength can also mean answering a call, forming a circle around the vulnerable, and refusing to let one body face danger alone. Chapter 17. The red light in the dark as the whale ascends. It feeds again, swallowing fish and a helmet jellyfish. The dying jellyfish emits bioluminescent light, filling the stomach with an eerie red glow. For the first time, Jay can truly see part of the world trapping him. He studies folds, passageways, wounds, debris, and possible routes. The image is beautiful and grotesque at once. Like Jay's memories of Mitt, love can exist inside damage without erasing it. Chapter 18. What really happened to Mitt? Jay gradually confronts the final year of Mitt's life. Mesothelioma destroyed the powerful man he remembered. Jay avoided phone calls, ignored messages, and stayed away even as his sisters begged him to come home. Mitt eventually went out on the water and killed himself using diving weights. Jay has interpreted that death as a message aimed at him. You left me, so I left forever. But inside the whale, the equation begins breaking apart. Mitt was terminally ill, frightened, controlling, proud, and deeply damaged long before Jay walked away. Jay's absence is part of the tragedy, but it is not the sole cause. Survivors often search for one decision that could have changed everything because guilt feels more controllable than helplessness. Chapter 19. The whale's throat. Jay discovers marks near the whale's throat, suggesting another animal once escaped. If something else found a way out, perhaps he can too. Using the jellyfish's light and whatever grip he can find, he climbs upward toward the throat and mouth. His body is increasingly destroyed. Burns, blood loss, damaged limbs, oxygen deprivation, and pressure injuries have turned every movement into a negotiation. Earlier, Jay wanted to repair the past. Now he is fighting simply to have a future. Life itself has regained value. Chapter 20. The whale calls out. Near the whale's larynx, Jay remembers anatomy lessons and knowledge from his sister Nan, a speech pathologist. He manipulates the whale's vocal structures and produces an unnatural, enormous cry. Above the surface, people hear it. Jay has forced his prison to announce that something impossible is happening inside it. Then the whale feeds again, knocking him back down the throat. His legs break, and determination alone is no longer enough. Chapter 21. Whalefall Jay accepts that he may die inside the animal. He thinks about a whalefall, the ecological process in which a dead whale sinks to the ocean floor and its body feeds an entire ecosystem for decades. Death in this image is not disappearance but transformation. Jay imagines himself becoming part of the whale and the whale becoming part of the sea. The idea gives Jay peace, but Mitt's voice keeps urging escape. Even a controlling father may have tried imperfectly to give his son tools for freedom. Chapter 22. Sleeper Arizia. Final memory returns from Jay's infancy. Mitt is holding him as a baby, crying and admitting that he fears he will ruin his son. He already recognizes something broken within himself. He promises the infant Jay that he will at least give him enough knowledge and tools to escape. The memory does not excuse abuse. It reveals a tragic contradiction. Parents can love children sincerely and harm them sincerely. Mitt was neither the local hero nor only the villain Jay needed him to be. He was his father. This is the emotional maturity the novel demands from Jay. Forgiveness here is not pretending the past was acceptable. It is releasing the need for Mitt to become one simple thing before Jay is allowed to move forward. Chapter 23. Fire in the belly, with his air nearly gone. Jay remembers lessons from his sister Eva, a chemical engineering student. Methane is accumulating in the stomach. Jay has oxygen in his tank, steel wool, and a 9-volt battery among his gear. Together they can create ignition. The problem is that an explosion inside a sealed stomach would kill him. Using Beaky, Jay cuts through the stomach wall into the whale's body cavity, creating a path for the blast. Beaky finally slips from his hand and disappears after saving him repeatedly. Jay then places the oxygen source, creates the spark, and ignites the methane. The explosion tears through the whale and catastrophically injures Jay, destroying much of one hand. Survival becomes the decision that even a damaged version of life is worth reaching. Chapter 24. Through the heart. The explosion throws Jay into the whale's body cavity among ruptured organs. He is no longer inside the stomach, but he is not outside. Massive anatomy surrounds him. He becomes trapped behind the whale's enormous heart. With almost nothing left, Jay tears through tissue and forces a route toward open water. Jay escapes through the region of the whale's heart only after understanding his father's. Love and injury can come from the same person, and one does not erase the other. Chapter 25. His father's remains. Jay is pulled from the ruined whale by rescuers connected to scientific and Coast Guard activity already operating nearby. He is catastrophically injured but alive. Offshore, sperm whales surface, their spouts rising in the distance like a final acknowledgement. Jay never finds Mitt's bones. The mission that brought him into the water has failed completely, yet the deeper mission succeeds. He realizes that he himself is what remains of his father. Mitt survives in his diving knowledge, his scars, his language, his mistakes, his fascination with whales, and even in the parts of Jay that must now be changed. The whale becomes tomb, womb, prison, father, and rebirth chamber. Jay enters searching for a corpse and emerges understanding inheritance. The title also refers to the ecological idea of a whalefall, death creating life on the seafloor. Mitt's death has nearly pulled Jay downward with him, but the same legacy eventually becomes material Jay can transform. Knowledge, memory, anger, and love are not fixed remains. Jay can decide what they feed next. Kraus offers no clean closure. Jay learns he can carry Mitt without being consumed by him. Mitt's old command, "Sleeper, arise!" now feels less like control than permission to wake into a life beyond him. The boy who entered the ocean looking backward is gone. The person who comes out is finally facing forward.